Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. On this week's episode, I am joined by the design journalist LinYee Yuan. LinYee is the founder and editor of Mold, a really fascinating digital and print magazine about designing the future of food. LinYee previously worked as an editor at the design site Core77. She worked for T Magazine and Theme and has written about design and art and food for publications like Food 52, Design Observer, Cool Hunting, Elle Decor, and Wilder Quarterly. In this episode, LinYee and I talk about how her interests in design and food overlapped and what we can learn about the intersections of these two fields. We talk about how writing for Core77 shaped her lens into the design world, why she started Mold, and the decisions she made to produce a print publication, as well as how Mold both enters into and subverts what we think of as a design magazine or a food magazine. We also talk about how community ecologies and indigenous wisdom shape so much of how we should be talking about food today and what we can learn from those ideas in both food and design. If you like the show, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for super fans. All of these tiers give you access to all sorts of bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episodes, full transcripts, and exclusive bonus interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. So if you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details and to help support the show. Thanks for listening, and here is my conversation with LinYee Yuan. I want to talk about Mold in a second, and I think a lot of this conversation will be about Mold, the publication that you've been running for a while now, almost 10 years now.
Yep.
But before that, I want to talk a little bit about you and your background and how you got into all of this. And so I've heard you talk about writing for Core77 and
That's
kind
right.
of coming across a story there that, you know, kind of made you think about the intersection of food and design. And so I'm kind of interested in what interests came first for you, maybe even pre-Core77. Were you interested in design or food, or how did those actually become interests for you?
Food has always been intertwined with my sense of identity. As a first generation Chinese American, I grew up in Texas. And, food was our family's love language. We would gather around food. We would, drive across town to go to the Chinese supermarket every week. Every community event, there was food. There's church lunches. There was, Chinese New Year feast. There was dim sum. There was Chinese bakeries. I mean, it just like endless kind of ways of thinking about food. Not only that, but my father, who is he's an engineer. He's a chemical engineer, and not like the most emotive human. But one of his two biggest passions in life are gardening and fishing, both that are very much connected to kind of knowing where your food comes from. And so growing up, I would go out fishing with him. One of my proudest moments was in like elementary school. We were fishing and I caught a stingray, and then we pulled her onto the boat, and then she gave birth to stingray babies on our boat. It was like insane.
Wow.
And, I grew up, picking strawberries from the garden. My father had a persimmon tree that he was like obsessed with even today. During the spring, my parents were here in New York, just helping me prepare for the birth of my second child. And my father was like obsessively checking in with his friend because he had this guava tree that was like getting ready to like produce fruit. And so I just always had a very, food was always just like this theme in the background of my life. So I wouldn't even call it an interest. It's definitely like a starring kind of character in the story of who I am. My mother is also a dietitian and nutritionist. And so, I very much just grew up understanding that food was something beyond just nourishment, and that there was science behind food. And also, just being Chinese, um, my parents, although I wouldn't say they practice traditional Chinese medicine, I think anybody who is first generation has understanding that food is very much connected with our health. And so all of these things really play into the way that I think about food, and the idea that I've always had a relationship with food thanks to my parents and my community.
I almost didn't ask that question because I just assumed food was kind of always the first one. So where did design come in? I saw that you went to Columbia. You studied Asian American Studies,
That's right.
and you've written about design and design related things for a variety of publications. How did design come into this story that you're telling right now?
So I didn't even know that design was a profession
Mm,
until I moved to New York.
okay.
And in my first year here, I interned for one of the first social media companies. It was called Asian Avenue.
Mm.
And I met a group of young designers. And I basically thought they were the coolest people I had ever met in my entire life, because they worked for themselves. They had this, great, this like amazing office on the Lower East Side in that school building that now I think is a community center. They worked for themselves. They would like take weeks off to go like snowboarding. They knew where all the, great clubs and bars and restaurants were. And I just was just so enamored with their lifestyle. And more than that, they were just making art basically, like in my mind. I mean,
Yeah.
they had client work, but I just, growing up in a kind of middle class immigrant community, I had never met a designer. I had never even thought that there were people in the world that were trained and then paid to like make things. And I just was like, my mind was blown, and so and so that was kind of my first introduction to design. And from there, I because I was obsessed with magazines from the time I could basically read, I started working in magazines and other media outlets and just met more and more designers. And so just through that, I just had the utmost respect for design, and but really more for designers as these kind of like these people who just had like the most exquisite taste and knew about the coolest music and could also talk about art, and made what I thought was basically commercial art.
So how did you start writing about design, or where did you realize that this was a subject that without being a designer, you could like be professionally in this world? You know what I mean?
Yep. So in 2000, I would say 2006 or 2007, I started working with a magazine called Theme, and
Mm,
it was and still is probably my favorite magazine of all time.
mm,
And it was founded and run by a couple that are both designers. And through my relationship with them, I started working full time with them as a managing editor for the magazine. And they just taught me so much about the art of making magazines, but also gave me permission to write about designers and design work. Although I don't have any design training. And I think that I just learned so much from them. And then through Theme, I ended up at Core 77
okay.
because one of the editors at Theme, who I also just happened to work with, who I had first met at Asian Avenue in my first internship in
Mm. Oh wow.
1998. So I had known Rain, who since '98 basically, and then worked with him again at Theme. He's been like the first contributor at Core 77, still is the contributor of course at Core 77, and it's kind of the voice of Core 77. He told me about a job opening there, and I applied for it not knowing much about the publication, and um, but just loving kind of the way that they worked, and they trusted me to manage the website. And I really credit my work at Core 77 as the real kind of turning point where I just totally fell in love with design. I fell in love
Mhm.
with the way that design as a profession was constantly, you know, in flux because specifically industrial design was at a huge turning point at that moment. iPhones had really just hit the market, and the this kind of idea of dematerialization was really kind of scary for industrial designers, like these people who their whole jobs is about materializing ideas and objects. And so I was just totally engrossed in the conversation around, the purpose of design, um, the future of design, its importance, or is it important? And I'm still very, very, very much interested in the way that designers see themselves in this kind of crisis moment um, that we're facing right now. And I guess really thinking about how designers see themselves in precarious moments, or precarity, period.
I'm wondering if you think being at Core 77 and kind of coming into design through that lens, how that shaped how you see design, or what it means to be a designer, or what it means to write about design.
Absolutely. I mean, coming into understanding of design through the lens of Core 77, it was completely instrumental in my story, because unlike other design publications out there, Core 77 is a site for designers, and it is fully focused on process and design as a process. um, the discussion boards at Core 77 are fascinating
Right.
because
Yeah.
it's really designers speaking to other designers about their interests, about, their needs, about resources. And I think that if I had come through another design publication, I may have just stopped at the idea of design as an object, or
Mm-hmm.
design as this finished thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that because Core 77 was always very much interested in being critical about the process, I just always thought of design as a critical field. And
Mm.
I think now that I teach at Parsons, I think about how design is one of the few professions out there where critique is really central, and being able to explain your process is very central to the work. Um, I don't, maybe not in kind of client relationships so much, but I do think within design education, the critique piece of it and the process driven nature of how to explain what design um, is very much, it's very important to, at least to
Yeah.
my um, to my hopes around the future of design, because it is about a process, because the constant examination of that process is part of design education. um, I find design having, there's a lot more space in design to be flexible, to be inclusive, to shift kind of the narrative. And I think that that's, to me, the most exciting thing about writing about design.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and actually helps me sort of think about mold and how it's a really nice context for how I see you as thinking about mold. And so mold is a publication. It started online, and then in 2018 you launched the printed.
That's right. So 2016 we launched the Kickstarter, and the first issue came out 2017.
Okay. And it's really easy to talk about mold as like a magazine about design and food. I've heard you talk about it as a magazine about the future of food. How do you describe mold now? Or what's your like tagline for mold, or your like top line,
Yeah.
elevator pitch?
Mold is an online and print magazine about designing the future of food.
Can you talk about how that idea sort of germinated while you were at Core 77?
Sure. I was an editor there, and I was traveling to, Milan and Beijing and all the different design festivals, and, really scouring the internet on a regular basis and pitches. And I started seeing an influx of, I would say, primarily student projects that were looking at the intersection of food and design.
Mm.
And I was just fascinated by these projects. Everything from designing tableware to uh, designing processes to collect or produce uh, food. And because design, at least within the context of education, is about problem solving, um, these students were really interested in, like, well, how are we going to feed ourselves in the future? And, like, how do we, like, decrease obesity amongst developed countries? It was just fascinating to me. But at the time, nobody was really writing about these projects because, for the most part, design outside of Course 77 on the internet was really like furniture and lighting.
Right, right.
And so I just started writing about those things. I was, some of like one of an early project that I thought was so fascinating was a group of design students were trying to figure out what a post carbon kitchen might look like.
Mm.
So using materials like terracotta and other types of kind of more traditional or ancient ways of storing food, they were like, what would a kitchen look like without a refrigerator? And I just loved the
Mm.
materiality of that project. I loved the final form that they took, and I loved the thinking behind it. And, again, nobody really wrote about it. I mean, it was a student project, but um, I just was really fascinated by the work that was coming out. And so, because of this gap in coverage, I was like, well, I am obsessed. Well, I don't want to say obsessed. I would say, food is very much part of my love language, and I can
Yeah.
definitely write about food, although I would never say I'm a food writer. Um, so I was like, let me just start a little place that we can just write about food design, and maybe it'll just be like an archive of food design projects that are coming out right now. And maybe I'll start like a discussion board where food designers can talk to one another. So it was really more about taking the kind of heart of what Core 77 does, which is to provide a online space and resource for industrial designers, but to think about that for what the potential might be for food design.
Maybe like the question behind the question is, I'm curious, you had this post at Core 77, where you could, and maybe you couldn't. Could you have written about these things on Core 77 or on an existing publication or a food publication? I'm kind of curious the decision, thinking this is a new thing. This could be its own site or its own publication. How did you think about that?
I absolutely could have written about it at Core 77. I was so lucky to have um, work with people who really, trusted me to write about those things. But at the time, I was just really like, I wanted a little, I'm somebody who always likes a little side hustle, like a little side project. And so I just wanted it to be like a little nights and weekends project. It was supposed to be like, speaking of blogs, it was supposed to be like a blog spot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And or I was like, maybe it'll just be a Tumblr page or something. It was
Okay.
very kind of, it wasn't supposed to be anything serious. But thanks to a friend of mine, I was introduced to a designer who had just left his full time position to start his own company. And I was like, hey, can you like just customize this WordPress theme for me? And
Yeah.
he was like, yeah, sure, I could do that. But honestly, like, it might take the same amount of energy for me just to build you a site. And I was like, okay, that's cool. And so we worked together and he built the site for me. And I just came out of the gate looking very professional. Yeah, and Andrew and Brandon, the design development team behind House of 207, they built the first site and then they ended up relaunching the site in 2021, early 2021. And so that's what you see on thisismold.com now.
It's interesting to hear you say that you saw this originally as like a side hustle, nights and weekends, and then working with these designers, and you had this sort of kind of professional sheen, right when it launched. I'm I'm curious about sort of the evolution of its goals, of what you wanted to do with it, and sort of the increase in ambition. And the reason I asked that is I came to the site later. It was probably right around the Kickstarter, a little bit before. I remember
Mhm.
when the Kickstarter launched and I had known of you and of the site. But how did it evolve from just a thing you were doing to collaborators and contributors and a sort of full-fledged publication? How did that all happen?
It's always been a collaborative project. I've been really
Mm.
lucky that people were able to kind of believe and see the vision for what it could be before it was really anything. So one of my earliest collaborators is Perrin Drum,
Mhm.
who you know through AIGA Ion Design.
Yep.
She and I had worked together in various ways, like uh, whether it was her writing for Core 77 and me editing, or me writing for
Right.
her when she was at Condé Nast and she editing me. And so I told her about this project, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm just looking for. I need like a editorial partner in this because it's hard for me to maintain the momentum around it, and I need somebody just to like share ideas and be accountable with." And she, was up for the job, and so she and I. She was my earliest collaborator on the
Mhm.
project, and then we launched our first design collaboration with Joey and Sina at Visibility, and
Mhm.
we created a picture with them. And so Mold has always been very much a collaborative project, and I think that for anybody who's ever made a magazine, that making magazines is probably one of the most collaborative things that anyone can really do. I always joke that I mean, I don't even, it's not really a joke, but I don't think that there's no such thing as a magazine made by one person.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I would, I always say that my professional tribe is actually people who love to make magazines.
Mm.
And so although Mold launched online, I was really resisting the idea of making a magazine because I was very intimidated by the idea of making a magazine in perpetuity. Um, I was very intimidated by the cost of
Mhm.
making
Mhm.
a print magazine. But in 2016, I had been writing online under Mold for, 2.5, 3 years at that point. And I was like, nobody understands what food design is. Like,
Yeah.
people still don't understand what this website is about. And I was like, well, the thing that makes the most sense to me is to make a design object that is actually shows people what food design
Mhm.
could be. And so I conceived of this six issue limited run print publication that would explore different facets of what food design could be. And so that's why it was always conceived as a thematic
Right.
print project and with a limited run of 6 issues.
That's really interesting. I had a couple questions about the print run, but you said something in there that I want to go back to for a second, where you said that nobody understands what food design is and no one understands what this website is. And uh, this is something I was thinking about as I was thinking about you and thinking about this conversation is what's always been interesting about mold to me is that it sort of goes against the expectations of what you think of as a design publication and what you think of as a food publication.
That's
It
right.
like challenges and subverts both of those.
Yep.
And so I was curious how you thought about audience and how you thought about with subverting both of those, how that was received, or like how you kind of thought about building that audience. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. um, I think mold was always conceived as a provocation.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I guess I have to admit that it's a bit in my personality to be like that.
Yeah.
Um, when I was actually thinking about names for the magazine, again, this was like 2012, 2013 that I started thinking about this. Or I was like, oh, what about mold? And I spoke to a whole bunch of friends of mine, and they were like, why would you do that? Like, why would you make a food website called mold? And I was like, exactly, because it's
Hmm.
not a food publication, it's a design publication. And molds are the forms that produce objects and on an industrial
Mm.
scale. And like mold also is this kind of transformative thing within the food system. So I always kind of I've always been a bit like pro provocation.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so as far as audience is concerned, again, it was originally conceived for food designers. And so I felt like food designers would get it. And food designers were and still are a very
Yeah.
small
Yeah.
audience. But as I started writing, I realized that our audience should be all designers
Right.
because
Right.
through the work of a student design project, I found, or I didn't find out, but I learned that we were facing or are facing a kind of inevitable food crisis. And I say this now in, post pandemic or, post 2020, and it seems like a no brainer. But
Hmm.
in 2012 or 2013, nobody was thinking that
Right.
we
Right.
were on the cusp of a food crisis. But the United Nations was like ringing the alarm bell, being like, okay, listen, everybody, in 30 years, we're not going to be able to feed ourselves if we continue eating the way that we do now. And I was just totally, totally shocked as somebody who loves food, loves to eat. I was like, how is this even possible? How are we not like falling out of our chairs right now trying to resolve this? And, this is like the era of like avocado toast. This is the
Right.
era,
Right.
like of like, this is pre millennial pink. This is just like such a insane time. And I just, it just was completely devastating to me that nobody in the food media was talking about it. Nobody in design world was talking about it. And I was just like, well, I have this thing that I do. There's really no better place to talk about this. And so, why don't we talk about how design might offer solutions for the coming food crisis? And that was this pivot to
Mm.
the conversation that we're invested in today.
I'm curious about this move from exclusively digital or online to print, and you talked about it being a way to sort of explain explain yourself maybe a little bit, or
That's right.
to to kind of present this in a different way. I'm curious what else in the process of making this printed publication, how did that change how you thought about mold or what mold could be?
I think that's a great question. I realized that mold, I would say first and foremost, I would say that the the kind of scope of and the mission of Mold has shifted since the first publication of the magazine.
Mm.
And you know, I now see the magazine almost as like a 5 year long, maybe even 6 year long uh, design research project.
Mm.
And I hope that the audience who has been with us from the early days of the print publication and the online publication has also been able to kind of follow along this trajectory from, I would say, more provocative, speculative design projects to where we are right now, which I see as a really urgent call for people to engage with the food system
Right.
as creators and co creators in the food system. How do we design hyper regional food systems that support hyper regional cuisines? And I think that this question is obviously not one that designers can answer alone.
Right.
But I
Right.
think that in the context of the ongoing crisis of the pandemic, the kind of visibility of how unjust the world is and how um, just inaccessible our food
Hmm.
system is, that people can see themselves in, in this kind of matrix and like think about ways that they can actually shape it for a more just present and future.
You set up exactly what my my next question was going to be, because I wanted to go back to this sort of, tagline about designing the future of food. And th- this question around the future of food is really interesting to me, because I think oftentimes when we talk about the future of anything, we're really just talking about the present and issues of,
That's right.
of the present, which I think Mold is doing. And I think it's really easy, especially when we're talking about the future of food, to think of lab grown meats, to think of
Yep.
technology, to
That's
think
right.
of, I don't know, Soylent and, all
That's
of this
right.
type of thing. And you cover that a bit, but,
Sure.
you also are talking about, I mean, you just wrote a piece that really is like a nice framing to everything you talked about food ecologies and sort of community economics. And you're talking about sort of returning to historical ways of thinking about these things. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that evolution and about sort of the balance isn't the right word, but sort of the holding the tension between technology, new innovation, and also um, these sort of old indigenous ways of thinking about food, and how those live together or work together in some way.
Sure. I'll just start by saying that I think that oftentimes when people talk about the future of food and they kind of immediately go to this techno future
Hmm.
or a homogenized future of like, Soylent or, meal replacements or whatever,
Yeah.
I think they really miss out on, I think, one of the most fundamental pieces of food, which is that food is culture
Mm.
and food is multisensory and joyful. So
Mm.
when we talk about the future of food, that should be our starting place. Like, how does the future, as you or I or Jeff Bezos see it, like
Hmm.
fit into this very foundational thing about our relationship with food, right? And
Hmm.
so I think that should always be the starting point. And the technological pieces of it, I think, are important because we have the science to um, change how we produce certain types of food or certain
Hmm.
types of nutrients or proteins or minerals or vitamins or whatever. And I think it's important to use it. But what I do see about kind of a techno future, food future, is that it is still owned by
Right.
companies. It is
Right.
still owned by a singular entity, and it does not empower people who are actually eating those foods in any sort of way. It still sees food almost as like just a nutrient formula, and I think that's very, very problematic. Um, I think that it's really, really important for food to be our relationship food to be liberatory.
Hmm.
And we see this in the ways that Native Americans and indigenous populations around the world are really advocating for food sovereignty as a foundational piece of their own liberation. Because what is, liberation without being able to have agency over what you eat and how you eat? So that's kind of one of my first kind of arguments against the techno foods. Like it's like who owns that technology, right? And also a lot of highly technical food solutions are still so energy intensive and still use old industrial models of extraction to produce, again, kind of a singular vision of what we're going to eat in the future. I don't think that solves anything for anyone. It's just replicating the same failed systems that we see from our food system. So, big ag, big food, it's just all trying to kind of feed us like a singular thing. And it's always going to um, prioritize profit over people.
Right.
It, that's not the food future I want to participate in.
I have a really big question that I want to make sure that I ask
Sure.
correctly, and I want you to know that I'm not asking you for a very specific, definitive answer here.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think this is a blanket statement, which is why I'm like nervous, kind of nervous to ask this question. I think the designer's impulse often is to look for those solutions, and is to think about new and the innovative and the technology, just because of the way design education is, because of kind of where designers are and where the money is and all of those all sorts of things like that. And something that comes up on this show a lot is this idea of sort of the designer savior complex, that the designer can kind of come in and solve a bunch of things and then move on. And I'm curious where you see the position of the designer in this future that you're talking about, and how to both blend the new with the old, and the community, and all of these things that you're talking about. Do you know you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like,
I hear
how
you.
does the designer not just paper over something to make it look like a solution, but
Yeah.
actually kind of participate in this?
Well, let's just start with the fact that design education has been very much steeped in kind of a colonial construct of
Hmm.
the role of design, and specifically industrial design, right? Like where, man is just like a piece of the machine, or
Right,
like this
right,
kind of
right.
argument for human centered design. So, humans we should be designing for humans only, and that human is the
Yeah.
white 20-year-old male, right?
Right,
Like,
right.
so I think that just recognizing that the roots of um, many kind of design education programs is a colonial project, I think, is the first thing that we need to talk
Mhm.
about.
Yeah, yeah.
But also, I think that there are so many interesting designers who are working in a way that says, actually, let's talk about designing with, as opposed to designing for. Let's
Hmm.
talk about designing for not human centered design, but more than human design.
Yeah, yeah.
What does that look like? And I think that is actually the most exciting work that's actually happening in design today. I mentioned that I teach design at Parsons, and one of the kind of foundational texts that we read is Alice Rawsthorne's Design as an Attitude.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
think that that's such a great place to start, that like maybe the most critical thing you can do as a designer is not designing anything at all.
Right.
And one of the powerful pieces of being a designer is that it's a profession, so you are taught within an educational context the tools of your trade, and b, that you're taught to ask the right question. So whereas I can only say this because my father is an engineer, but like engineers are taught to get the most efficient way from getting from point A
Mhm.
to B. Designers are like, oh, we actually need to back up a little bit. We need to do interdisciplinary research. So we need to talk to experts across the field, but also the experts in my argument, who are the people who will actually be using this design, and then ask the right question so that we know what the problem is that we're actually trying to solve. And so because designers are taught to be systems thinkers out the gate, I think we kind of have a leg up from
Mm.
other types of
Mhm.
professions that allows us to be critical, that uses critical thought as very much part of the process. So the fact that we can say, industrial design and the way design education has been taught has been colonial, and everybody's like, yes, nodding their head and okay. It's like, wow, okay, great. Like,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
glad we can all agree to that and be critical. Now, where we go from there, that's up to, the designers to ask that question and ask the right questions around that. But I do think that just starting from a place of critique and from reflection and research is really, really powerful.
Let me ask you that question that you just kind of posed there about what we do with that information. Let me ask you that for yourself. What's next for you, or what's next for Mold? Where do you see all of this work going?
So we are starting a nonprofit
Mm.
organization, and it's really about taking the work that we've been writing about for the past, 8 years, and looking at it, uh, seeing how it works in practice.
Oh
And
wow.
I'm very scared. I'm very unclear about what that's going to
Yeah.
look like. And so, I'm just kind of jumping into the abyss a bit, but I also just feel so excited about the opportunity to think about design as a seed, specifically in the community that I live in, which is Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and thinking about how it's easy to write about things, right? Like it's easy to be critical and sit on my computer here in Brooklyn and be like blah 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 blah, like about
Yeah. Yeah.
people's projects. But it's a different thing to actually be out in the community and use design as a lever to engage people in my community and be like, what do you need? Like, how do you need it? Like, what can we do to be part of this conversation? um, I had an opportunity to participate in a reading group last night that we were reading Dean Spade's Mutual Aid book, and I was just so I was just taking all the notes, and I really hope that the nonprofit that we started will be able to take the learnings from mutual aid and put that into action. So, one of the questions I have is like, well, what does a mutual aid model for design look like? Like, how could we? What are the what's the scaffolding of that project? Um, One of the projects that we teach in my class is we talk about the architect Teddy Cruz's projects on the border between the United States and Mexico, and just how powerful his way of viewing the world is. I mean, he is an architect, and so many architects are just so specific about what they're building, like, and Teddy Cruz, his project is about building the scaffolding and allowing the communities themselves to determine what the built environment looks like and how it works for them. And so I really appreciate that perspective. and am thinking very much about how the work that we're going to participate in this nonprofit that we're building will similarly provide a certain kind of scaffolding and allow our community to be self-determining and have agency over what that food system might look like here.
That sounds great. So you said you're not totally sure what that looks like or how that sort of lives in the world. Where are you in the process of developing the nonprofit?
So, I think that, well, we're like incorporating. We have a board.
Okay.
And I have an idea of what our first project will be. But really, I see this first, the coming years being asking the questions, right? Like, what does our community need? Who are the people who are doing this work in the community now? How can we support that work through design? And I don't know what the answers are yet because we haven't quite embarked on it. But I'm trying to learn as much as I can from people who are doing this work in other places, designers who have already piloted different types of programs, and just really trying to be open to what comes. I think that that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned from Mold is that you can kind of have an idea of what you want to do and where you want to go, but just being open to the ideas, the work itself, shaping itself is quite exciting.
I think that's a really nice way to wrap up this conversation. So I'm going to ask you the last question that I use to end all of these. I'm just curious what you're reading right now. You mentioned you're in a reading group and you're reading Mutual Aid, but what else is on your reading list right now?
Oh my gosh. I mentioned that I'm a new mother, so I have a lot of things on just backed up in my reading list. I'm going to look at so I have, I've been reading Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. I just reread it this summer, but I'd like to kind of revisit it now. I am reading this book called Bringing the Food Economy Home. It's basically about local futures. It's by this woman who kind of coined the term ancient futures, and heads this nonprofit about local community economics. I started Robin Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass about 2 years ago. I would like to finish it. And I have the most recent issue of Deem magazine.
Oh yeah.
It's issue 2. Issue 3 is coming out, but I need to finish issue 2, which is about pedagogy for a new world.
Right. And you were in the first issue. I interviewed the Deem.
Oh, great!
When that came out,
they're amazing. I was part of their online issue, so yeah.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, and they're incredible humans, and I'm so thankful that I get to call them my friends.
Yes. Yeah. That's a really nice reading list too. This was such a great conversation. It was so nice to hear about kind of how you think about this work and also where you see this all going. So thank you. Thanks for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks, Jarrett. I really appreciated the time.
This episode was recorded on January 24th, 2022. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon. You can find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.